I'm back again for another episode of Real Railroads. Having a little difficulty not able to sit where I usually do, so sitting where I usually sit on, so a little higher up in the frame than normal, but this episode is going to be on Conrail, New York. Not that much into detail, just a basic overview of at least this side of New York. I have to keep it short so it doesn't use up the memory on my phone, so when Consolidated Rail Corporation was formed in April 1st, 1976, they inherited a lot of redundant track. The Penn Central, Erie, Lackawanna, and Lehigh Valley all had at least one rail line in the state. The NYC mostly ran east-west, north of the Finger Lakes, while the PRR ran north out of Pennsylvania. The Penn Central gave Conrail both these routes, and except for the secondary lines mentioned in the video on the New York Central, only 4 main routes lasted until the Conrail split. These were the NYC Water Level Route, PRR Buffalo Line, Erie Buffalo Line, and Erie Main Line. The Erie Main Line ran from New Jersey to Hornell and then to Meadville, Pennsylvania. The Erie Buffalo Line ran from Hornell to Buffalo. Between these was the River Line that ran from Portage to Cuba, which provided a cutoff for Erie trains going between Buffalo and points west. The PRR Buffalo Line ran north-south from Pennsylvania to Buffalo, passing through Olean, crossing the Erie Main Line in Olean and the B&O at Machias Junction. The NYC Water Level Route crossed the state from the Hudson River to the Pennsylvania state line east of Erie, PA, plus the River Line, which runs to NYC. The Lehigh Valley was the most redundant line, serving the same area as the NYC, and thus was the first to be abandoned. Most of the redundant DL&W trackage had already been abandoned by Erie, Lackawanna. The creation of Conrail had made a monopoly in the Northeast, and this had been remedied by the Delaware and Hudson being given trackage rights over a few Conrail routes, but Conrail liked to prioritize their own trains. On the Southern Tier line, which had mostly double track, the speed limit was often as low as 10 miles per hour, but if one track was faster, they would deliberately put D&H trains in the slower track, so D&H would end up going 10 miles per hour, while Conrail trains would pass at 30 miles per hour. Conrail put as much traffic as they could onto the former NYC and tried their best to let the Southern Tier line die. D&H had trackage rights on the Southern Tier from Buffalo to Binghamton, along with the former DL&W to Greggsville. To reach the G&W, which was mentioned in a previous episode, Conrail abandoned everything they didn't see the use for. This included the Erie between Batavia and Avon, which I believe was 1996. They abandoned the former DL&W in 1986 and had abandoned the former NYC Peanut Line before then. All these abandonments are mentioned in other videos, and I did not look through the other scripts to see you already have the information if you watch those other episodes. They sold off other trackage to short lines, including the former NYC Auburn route to the Finger Lakes Railway, the former DL&W between Gang Mills and Wayland to the Bath and Hammondsport, etc. When the Conrail split happened, Conrail only had the Southern Tier line between Port Jervis, New Jersey and Buffalo, New York. The Meadville line from Hornell, New York to Buffalo, Pennsylvania, to Meadville, Pennsylvania, the Buffalo line from Buffalo south into Pennsylvania, which crossed the Meadville line in Olean, and the former NYC main line that crossed the state and went on to Erie, PA, and some branch lines. The CSX got the former NYC trackage, while NS got the PRR and Erie trackage, which included the Southern Tier, Buffalo, and Meadville lines. The Buffalo line is now leased by Buffalo and Pittsburgh between Buffalo and Machias Junction, by the Western New York, Pennsylvania between Machias Junction, New York, and Driftwood, Pennsylvania, but dormant between Machias and Olean. The Meadville line is leased by WNYP, but is dormant between Cuba and Hornell. NS used to run coal trains on this line from PA to lower power plants in New England and New York, but that stopped around 2006-2009 era. The Southern Tier line is owned and operated by NS between Buffalo and Binghamton, while the rest of Port Jervis is leased by the Central New York Railway and operated by commuter lines in the New York, Susquehanna, and Western. The NYSW comes into Binghamton on this trackage. Rail yards are many and several remain. The Conrail predecessors had many yards in Buffalo, sometimes 2 to 3 yards. These were reduced considerably through the years, and now only about 20 yards remain that were once Conrail in the entire state. In Buffalo, there are some smaller yards that I can never remember the proper names for each of them and their boundaries in South Buffalo and Lackawanna. There are two yards near the Buffalo Creek, one on the east side, which now seems to be used for storage now, and one on the west side, which is for industries at the port, which is not as active as it once was. I believe the east side one is NS and the west side one is CSX. Through here, the tracks meld together, and CSX and NS occupy the same space, making it hard to tell what is what without seeing them running by. Farther south is the yard where CSX has their Buffalo Intermodal Terminal. This yard, you will also see the Buffalo and Pittsburgh trains run around it, as the former Lackawanna Steel Mill is to the west of the yard, and there are several industries, plus the docks are used to ship coal brought north by the BPRR occasionally. CSX also has the former Conrail yards north of Buffalo in Kenmore and Niagara Falls. Kenmore Yard was much busier when Tonawanda Coke was operating, as coal and coke were handled there. Now it's just used for industries in the area. Niagara Falls Yard, I believe, handles interchange traffic between CSX and Canada, plus handles traffic for the many Niagara Falls industries. The last small yard in Buffalo is SK Yard, which is owned by NS and is pretty dormant now that CP lost use of it in 2009. This was used by the D&H from 1976 to 2006, and then CP from 2006 to 2009. It has a few industries around it, including U.S. Sugar, but a few are abandoned as well. The main yards are Frontier Yard and Bison Yard. Bison Yard is a flat switch yard and has always been one. This is located between William Street and Buffalo on the west end, and just beyond Harlem on the east end, Harlem Road on the east end. This is Norfolk Southern's classification yard in Buffalo, serving local industries, and has 4 industries in the yard limits, including an auto facility, 2-track intermodal facility, 2-track tank car facility, and a scrap yard. This originates local freights, including the NS local that interchanges with the RSR down here, and the interchange of the Depew, Lancaster, and Western's Depew division is Bison Yard as well. The other yard is Frontier Yard, which is a hump yard, and this occupies what was once the NYC stockyards in Buffalo, and is mainly between Bailey Avenue on the west and Walden Avenue on the north, Harlem Road on the east, and Broadway on the south. The hump use supposedly was taken out of service in 2009, but I found no confirmation of this beyond a blurb on the forum train orders, which I have found to be only half reliable. The last time I was in Buffalo, however, the hump had no rails on it, and they were getting ready to flatten the hump. This yard is operated by CSX now and is still fairly active despite PSR reducing the train amounts. In Rochester, New York, is Goodman Street Yard, which serves the local industries. The RSR interchange originates the local that runs to Batavia to serve Cargill and the Depew, Lancaster, and Western's Batavia division. There is a small yard in Alliance, New York, but this I don't believe is used much. In Solvay, and New York, is the yard that is the end of the former Auburn Road, now used to interchange between CSX and the Finger Lakes Railway, plus NYSW uses this to interchange with the FGLK. The next major yard is Dewitt Yard in Syracuse, which also was a hump yard that they flattened years ago. This serves a few industries today under CSX, plus interchanges with the NYSW. This is also an intermodal facility and hub that, besides its 2 tracks for loading and unloading intermodal, also classifies intermodal or for Worcester, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and points west, originating a few intermodal trains and swapping cars between passing trains. On an online train game I tried 3 years ago, this was one of my yards, and I can tell you it is busy despite PSR reducing traffic volume. But more on that game when I can do the review on it that I have been planning for a couple of years that are coming down from the way I was treated there. The last major yard from the CSX line is Selkirk Yard, which is still a hump. This is still a hump yard and is massive, serving CSX's main northeast, CSX's main northeast classification yard. Other yards in New York are on what is now NS. Silver Springs was considered a yard more under Conrail than today, and they even had a switcher here, which was usually a GP10. Now it's just an interchange controlled by the NS dispatcher and the Gang Mills yardmaster. Gang Mills Corning area had 2 yards, one in Painted Post and the former DL&W, which is completely removed. The Gang Mills yard is now NS and is the interchange of the NS and short lines BHRC and WCOR, and a third in Corning, which was used for coal trains going to the power plant in Dresden. This yard is now usually empty, with trains passing on the Corning secondary heading to and from the FGLK interchange in Geneva, which is also a former Conrail yard, along with the yard at the former coal power plant in Dresden. There used to be a yard in Elmira, but I am not sure if it is still in use or even exists anymore. There also is a yard in Hornell, but that is seldom used and is about half or third of its former size. The next yard is Owego, I believe, and that is the interchange with the Owego and Hartford. There was also a yard in Sayre, PA, but this is used by the Lehigh Railway and the Ithaca Central today. The last Conrail yards in freight operations today in New York is the yards in Binghamton. This is the NS Nysw Yard along the southern tier. NS operates the south side, and Nysw operates the north side, which is with the most amount of track. NS, since acquiring the D&H through Binghamton, has moved their classification operations to mostly occupying the former D&H East Binghamton Yard in Conklin, New York, along the Susquehanna River, and they occasionally use the former D&H Bevier Street Yard north of the Binghamton Y on the former D&H to Albany. Conrail used everything in New York, but the AC units were fairly rare. Occasionally you would see an SD80 Mac or SD70 Mac on a coal train, but the dominant power were Alcos, GP9, GP10, GP38, GP38-2, GP30, GP40, GP40-2, GP35, SD40, SD40-2, SD38, SD50, SD45, SD60, U-boats, -7, and -8 GE units. The D&H brought more variety to Conrail rails with their various paint schemes of patched Lehigh Valley and Lehigh and Hudson River units to blue Alco RS models and C424s with yellow noses or yellow stripes on the ends, plus their infamous gray and blue with yellow lightning stripe. Norfolk and Western power also ran in Conrail, with the D&H being controlled by them for their time, and then Guilford Transportation with their main central units and MEC yellow, Boston and Maine units, patched former Detroit Edison units, and units in the GTI scheme. Then Canadian Pacific later offered GP9, GP7, GP38, GP40, GP38-2, GP40-2, GP39-2, SD40, more U-boats, CP C630, M630, RS18, and such, including the CP SD40-2F units, plus visiting power, making Conrail in New York a veritable rainbow and through its life, especially where the D&H ran. This concludes the episode on Conrail, New York, at least as much as I can get in one video. Tune in next week when I cover a local short line, the Livonia, Avon, and Lakeville. I would have gone into more detail, but I try to keep these as short as possible, and that's the general thing. General information.